I had worked for years to save enough money to buy my first apartment. It wasn't much, but it was mine. A place where I felt safe, independent, and proud of what I had achieved. I remember the day I signed the papers, the sense of accomplishment washing over me. I never imagined that one day, that home would be taken from me without a single word. It started as an ordinary evening. I walked up to my building, carrying groceries, humming a tune to myself. But when I reached the door of my apartment, something felt off. The lock had been changed. My keys didn't work. I fumbled with them, heart racing. I knocked, hoping maybe it was a mistake, but no one answered. Then I saw a notice taped to the door: the apartment had been sold. I froze. My mind wouldn't process it at first. Sold? How? Why? I called my parents immediately. "Emma, honey, we thought you'd understand," my mother said, her voice calm, almost casual. My father echoed, "It was for the family." For the family? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They had sold my home to pay for Claire's wedding. A $300,000 wedding. And they hadn't told me a thing. I felt my stomach twist. I could hear Claire in the background, laughing and talking about flower arrangements and her dress, completely unaware of the destruction left behind. It hit me like a punch to the chest. All the late nights I had worked extra shifts, the sacrifices I had made, it all didn't matter. My parents had chosen her dreams over my life. Over me. The betrayal cut deeper than I expected. I had always trusted my parents. They had been my guides, my support system. But now, I realized that trust had been a one-way street. They had smiled at me at family dinners, hugged me, and called me their responsible daughter, but behind my back, they made choices that shattered me. Anger bubbled inside me, sharp and fierce. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to make them feel even a fraction of what I was feeling. But it wasn't just anger. There was a deep, gnawing helplessness. I had nowhere to go. My apartment, my safe space, was gone. I felt like a ghost in my own life, invisible, dismissed, replaced by Claire's wants and wishes. Sitting on the curb outside the building, I let the tears come. Not just for the apartment, but for the realization that the people I had trusted most could betray me so completely. I didn't know how I would move forward, but I knew one thing: I wouldn't let this define me. I would find a way to reclaim my life, to take back control, and to show them that even betrayal can't break me completely. Before everything happened, our family life had seemed normal on the surface. We ate dinner together, joked about little things, and went through the motions of family life. But over time, I started noticing patterns that didn't sit right with me. My parents always seemed to bend over backward for Claire, showering her with attention, gifts, and praise, while my efforts and achievements were met with polite nods or quiet acknowledgement. Claire had a way of commanding the room. She knew exactly what to say to make my parents light up. Even small things, like getting an A on a test or helping with chores, were celebrated for her but barely noticed for me. At first, I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was imagining things. But then came the invitations to extra classes, the lessons, the designer clothes, everything seemed to flow effortlessly to her. The wedding planning was where it became impossible to ignore. My parents spoke endlessly about flowers, venues, dresses, and entertainment, always emphasizing how family tradition required a grand, unforgettable celebration. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, listening to my mother talk about how much they were willing to spend. $300,000. Just for Claire's day. I felt a knot in my stomach. I wanted to speak up, to ask how that money could have been used for something practical or shared between us, but the words wouldn't come. I began paying closer attention to their choices. Claire could call at any time and ask for anything, and it would be delivered. A sudden shopping trip? Done. A late-night delivery of a cake she suddenly decided she wanted? On the way. Meanwhile, I had to ask and justify every small expense, every plan I made. The more I observed, the more I realized this wasn't about generosity or love, it was favoritism. It wasn't just about money. It was about values. I saw my parents prioritizing appearances and social status over fairness and respect. Their idea of family was skewed toward pleasing Claire at every turn. I started questioning everything I thought I knew about them. Were they really on my side, or had I been living under an illusion? At first, it made me sad. I felt small and invisible, like my needs didn't matter. But slowly, that sadness turned into something else, an awareness that I couldn't count on them the way I used to. I began thinking about how I could protect myself in the future, how I could make sure my life wasn't completely dictated by their favoritism. The tension in the house became almost unbearable. Every conversation, every mention of Claire's wedding, reminded me that I was living in a family where love was measured in spending and attention, not fairness or respect. I didn't yet know that their favoritism would cost me everything I had worked for. But the seeds of doubt, anger, and determination were already planted. I started to see my parents, and Claire, through new eyes, and I knew deep down that things were about to change. I couldn't believe how blind I had been. I had spent years saving every extra dollar, working late shifts, skipping nights out, all to pay for my apartment. It wasn't just a place to live, it was a symbol of my independence, a reward for all my hard work. And then, in one cruel moment, it was gone. When I finally calmed down enough to think clearly, I asked my parents for details. That's when the truth hit me harder than the lock on the door had. They hadn't just sold the apartment, they had signed all the legal documents themselves. Without telling me. Without asking me. Every signature, every decision, completely hidden. They treated my life and my money like it didn't matter, like I was nothing more than a bystander in my own story. I remember the meeting with my father. He spoke slowly, as if trying to make the words sound reasonable. "Emma, we did what we thought was best for the family," he said. My mother nodded silently beside him. But I couldn't hear anything beyond the betrayal. The apartment was gone, and with it, all the sacrifices I had made. All the nights I had worked double shifts. All the weekends I had skipped to save money. I wanted to scream, to cry, to shake them until they understood the gravity of what they had done. I had trusted them completely, and they had chosen Claire over me. My own parents had decided that her dreams were worth more than my hard work, my stability, and my future. The anger I felt wasn't just about money, it was about trust, respect, and fairness. It was about realizing that the people who were supposed to protect me had turned against me. Sitting on my empty apartment floor, I replayed every memory, every small sign I had ignored. The favoritism, the lavish attention toward Claire, the way they justified spending anything for her. It all made sense now, and the bitterness burned like fire in my chest. But beneath the anger, beneath the shock, a plan began to form. I wouldn't let this betrayal break me completely. I would find a way to turn it around, to reclaim some control, to make them see that choosing her over me had consequences. I didn't yet know exactly how I would do it. The idea of revenge was just a spark, faint but persistent. It wasn't about money alone, it was about respect, about showing my parents that their choices couldn't erase me. That their favoritism and carelessness wouldn't define my life. That I could rise above their betrayal and take my power back, step by step. For the first time, I realized that life wasn't fair, and sometimes the people you love most can hurt you the deepest. But I also realized that I had a choice. I could stay crushed under their selfishness, or I could use their betrayal to fuel me. And I knew, deep down, that I wasn't going to let them win. I couldn't stay silent any longer. I needed answers, and I needed them now. I marched into the living room where my parents were sipping coffee, acting as if everything was normal. My heart pounded in my chest, my hands trembled, but I forced myself to speak. "Why did you sell my apartment without telling me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. My father, Robert, looked up slowly, his expression calm. "Emma, we did it for the family," he said, almost too casually. My mother, Linda, nodded in agreement. "We thought it was the right thing to do. You'll understand someday." I stared at them, my mouth dry. The right thing to do? My apartment? My life savings? You sold my home for Claire's wedding and didn't even have the decency to tell me. My voice rose despite my effort to stay calm. Claire appeared in the doorway, twirling in her new dress, completely oblivious to the storm brewing. Mom, Dad, did you see the cake designs? Isn't it gorgeous? She said, beaming. I wanted to shake her, to make her understand that my world had just collapsed, but she didn't even notice me. She had no idea what had happened, no clue about the betrayal. I turned back to my parents, my anger boiling over. Do you realize what you've done? I trusted you. I worked for years, saved every dollar, and you just threw it all away for her. My chest felt tight, my hands clenched into fists. I couldn't believe I had thought I could reason with them. Their eyes were calm, almost detached, as if my pain was nothing more than background noise. It's for the family, my father repeated, like a broken record. My mother added, we had to make sacrifices. Claire's wedding is important. Important? Important to whom? Certainly not to me. Their words felt like knives, cutting deeper than I thought possible. Every memory of my efforts, my sacrifices, my dreams, felt meaningless. And the worst part was knowing they didn't even see the damage they had done. They truly believed that choosing Claire over me was justified, that her happiness mattered more than my life. I realized then that reasoning with them was impossible. I couldn't appeal to fairness, to morality, to love. They had chosen, and their choice was clear. The betrayal wasn't a mistake or an accident, it was deliberate. It was rooted in their priorities, in the way they had always valued Claire above me. I felt a mix of despair and fire inside me. Despair because the people I loved most had hurt me the deepest. Fire because I knew I couldn't let it end there. I had to find a way to reclaim control, to make sure my life wasn't crushed under their favoritism and selfishness. This confrontation didn't solve anything, but it lit a spark inside me. I left the room knowing one thing for certain, they would never understand me, never see the damage they had done, and that was why I had to take matters into my own hands. Their betrayal had pushed me to a decision I hadn't made before, I would no longer be powerless. After that day, something inside me changed. I stopped arguing. I stopped begging for understanding. I realized that anger alone wouldn't fix what had been done. If I wanted my life back, I had to be smart. Quiet. Careful. I decided that I would reclaim my power, not by causing chaos, but by thinking several steps ahead. I began watching everything closely. Every conversation, every sudden expense, every decision my parents made around the wedding. I listened more than I spoke. When my mother mentioned payments or contracts, I made mental notes. When my father talked about money being handled, I paid attention to what he didn't say. I started writing things down privately, keeping a clear record of dates, numbers, and promises that didn't add up. The more I observed, the clearer the picture became. Money was moving fast, and not always in the ways they claimed. Some payments were rushed. Some decisions were poorly thought out. There were gaps in their explanations, moments where the truth felt twisted to fit their story. I didn't confront them. I didn't react. I stayed calm, even when my chest burned with anger. Inside, I was furious, but it was a quiet kind of anger. Focused. Controlled. I reminded myself every day why I was doing this. I had lost my home, my security, and my trust in the people who raised me. I wasn't going to let them walk away without consequences. Not out of cruelty, but out of justice. I also began thinking about leverage. Not revenge for the sake of hurting them, but exposure. Accountability. If they believed they could erase my sacrifices and rewrite the truth, they were wrong. I noticed how much they cared about their image, about appearing united and respectable. That mattered to them more than my feelings ever had. And that knowledge gave me clarity. Claire remained lost in her own world, surrounded by plans and excitement. She talked endlessly about decorations, venues, and guest lists, never once questioning where the money came from. I didn't interrupt her. I let her talk. Every word confirmed what I already knew: no one was going to protect me but myself. Late at night, when everything was quiet, I organized my thoughts. I wasn't rushing. I understood that timing mattered. A single mistake could ruin everything. So I waited, gathered facts, and strengthened my resolve. Each day, I felt less like a victim and more like someone in control. I didn't know exactly how or when things would unfold, but I knew this much: the truth always has weight. And when it finally drops, it changes everything. My parents believed the situation was settled. They were wrong. What they couldn't see was that their betrayal had sharpened me, not broken me. And when the moment came, they would have no one to blame but themselves. By this point, I had settled into my new role: quiet observer and careful planner. I knew I couldn't confront my family directly yet, but I could start creating small ripples, subtle disruptions that would make them pause and reconsider. I didn't want to ruin the wedding. Claire deserved her day, but I wanted them to feel a fraction of the stress and confusion they had caused me. I began attending meetings about the wedding, always polite, always calm, but with a sharp eye. When vendors discussed prices, I asked questions that made them pause. "Are you sure this cost is correct, or wouldn't it be better to compare a few more options before committing?" It wasn't aggressive. It was just enough to make people double-check and slow down. Every little pause was a tiny victory. I also noticed the small logistical problems no one seemed to consider. Timing issues between the catering and entertainment, delivery schedules that didn't quite match, seating arrangements that could cause confusion. I mentioned them casually, almost as if I was trying to be helpful. Every time, someone would take a note, and I could see the stress start to ripple through the planning team. It wasn't chaos, just tiny moments that made them think, made them work harder, and maybe for the first time, question if they had overlooked anything. Money was another area I could influence subtly. Claire and my parents were spending freely, almost recklessly. I made comments about cost efficiency: "Are we sure we need that many extras? Or maybe we can find a way to save a little here." Again, nothing direct, nothing obvious. Just suggestions that planted doubts and slowed decision-making. It wasn't sabotage in the mean sense, it was a way to show them that every choice had consequences. The best part was watching them notice the small mishaps and inconsistencies without realizing I had anything to do with them. A miscommunication with a vendor, a slight delay in deliveries, a minor oversight, they started looking at each other nervously, trying to figure out what went wrong. Meanwhile, I stayed in the background, calm and collected. No one suspected me, and that gave me a quiet sense of satisfaction. Inside, I felt a growing sense of justice. I wasn't yelling or blaming anyone. I wasn't creating chaos. I was simply letting the truth of their carelessness show itself in small, undeniable ways. It wasn't just about Claire or the wedding, it was about my parents seeing that life isn't always perfect, that mistakes and mismanagement have consequences, and that I wasn't powerless. For the first time since the apartment incident, I felt control again. Every subtle question, every tiny correction, every moment of hesitation I caused built my confidence. It was my way of reclaiming power, piece by piece, without anyone knowing it was me. And with every small victory, I realized something important: revenge didn't have to be loud or obvious. Sometimes, it was quiet, clever, and completely unstoppable. After weeks of careful observation and quiet intervention, I realized it was time to take the next step. Subtle disruptions were satisfying, but I needed something more concrete, something that would force my parents to recognize the consequences of their actions. I began researching my legal options, determined to reclaim at least some control over the life they had stolen from me. I discovered that the sale of my apartment wasn't as airtight as they thought. Certain procedures had been rushed, documents signed without my consent, and some legal requirements overlooked. I consulted with a lawyer and learned that I could challenge the sale, or at the very least, uncover financial mismanagement that might force my parents to account for their decisions. I started organizing everything I had recorded: expenses, contracts, timelines, and inconsistencies. Each note, each record became ammunition, not for revenge in a mean sense, but for justice. I prepared myself to approach them calmly, armed with facts, and ready to assert my rights. I wasn't angry in front of anyone, I was composed, determined, and strategic. When I first brought it up, my parents reacted with disbelief. "Emma, this is unnecessary," my father said, trying to brush it off. My mother looked worried, her calm mask slipping. I laid out everything I had found, the rushed paperwork, the missing approvals, the way money had been handled for Claire's wedding. I spoke clearly and confidently, refusing to back down. For the first time in my life, they seemed genuinely unsettled. Claire, who had been floating in her wedding bubble, began to notice small cracks too. Vendors double-checked schedules, payments were questioned, and delays started to appear in her carefully planned day. She looked around nervously, realizing that things weren't falling perfectly into place. I didn't need to say a word to her, the truth was showing itself naturally, and it was enough to make her pause. I could feel the balance starting to shift. My parents were no longer untouchable. Their control, their favoritism, their sense of untouchable authority, it was all being challenged. They could see that I wasn't afraid to stand up, that I had the tools and knowledge to fight for what was mine. The fear in their eyes, subtle but undeniable, was a quiet satisfaction I had never felt before. This was about more than money. It was about reclaiming my voice, proving that their decisions weren't above scrutiny, and showing them that betrayal has consequences. I felt a sense of empowerment I hadn't experienced in years. Every careful step I had taken, every observation and note, was coming together to create a clear path toward justice. For the first time, I realized that I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was shaping the outcome. The tables had turned, and I was no longer the powerless daughter. I was the one in control, quietly steering the situation, and the consequences for my parents and Claire were inevitable. The day of the wedding had been chaotic, just as I had predicted. Vendors were rushing, small problems were piling up, and Claire's perfect vision was starting to crack. I knew it was the moment I had been waiting for. I asked everyone to pause for a moment and called a family meeting in the living room. My parents looked at me with irritation at first, expecting me to stay quiet, but I didn't. I was ready. I laid out everything I had collected over the past weeks, receipts, contracts, timelines, and notes. I showed how the apartment had been sold without my consent, how money had been handled carelessly, and how favoritism had guided every decision. I didn't yell. I didn't exaggerate. I just spoke clearly, calmly, and with the weight of truth behind every word. My parents froze. Their faces shifted from disbelief to shock as I explained the facts. I could see the tension in my father's jaw and the tightness in my mother's hands. For the first time, they weren't able to brush off my concerns. The calm, confident control they had always held over the family was gone. They were confronted with the reality of their decisions, and it was undeniable. Claire, who had been busy adjusting flowers and checking seating charts, finally looked up. Her smile faltered. She realized that her carefully curated day wasn't as perfect as she had believed. Her excitement was replaced by guilt and embarrassment. I didn't need to point out her entitlement, it was obvious in the way the wedding had started to spiral and how she had ignored the people she had hurt along the way. I spoke from the heart, letting them hear the pain they had caused me. "I trusted you," I said. "I worked hard for my life, and you chose her over me without even telling me. This isn't just about money, it's about respect, fairness, and trust. I have been invisible to you for too long." My voice shook, but I held it together. The room was silent. The weight of my words hung in the air. I could see my parents finally understanding, not fully, perhaps, but enough to feel the sting of what they had done. Claire looked down at her hands, realizing that her happiness had come at my expense. It wasn't just a small mistake, it was a pattern of favoritism and entitlement that had left me hurt and powerless for years. For the first time, I felt the power shift in the room. I wasn't a passive victim anymore. I wasn't pleading or begging. I was standing up for myself, exposing the truth, and making it impossible for them to ignore. Their shock, combined with Claire's sudden awareness of her own role, gave me a sense of closure I hadn't thought possible. By the end of the meeting, the tension was heavy, but I felt lighter. I had spoken my truth, faced the betrayal, and demanded recognition. For the first time in years, I was being seen. And even though the wedding continued with its chaos, I knew something had changed. I had finally stood up for myself, and nothing would ever erase that. After the confrontation, things in the family changed quickly. My parents, who had always acted untouchable, suddenly faced the reality of their choices. Their handling of the wedding and the apartment sale became impossible to ignore. Friends and relatives started noticing inconsistencies in how the wedding had been planned, the rushed decisions, and the expensive mistakes. Small whispers grew into questions about why so much money had been spent without consulting everyone involved. Even Claire, who had been so focused on her perfect day, began to feel the weight of it all. Guests noticed delays, miscommunications, and minor mishaps that could not be explained away. Her flawless wedding fantasy had cracks, and she could no longer hide behind glamour and excitement. The embarrassment was subtle but undeniable. Relationships that had once seemed solid began to feel strained. Some family members looked at my parents with quiet judgment, realizing that their favoritism and careless planning had caused unnecessary stress and conflict. Through it all, I watched quietly. I didn't have to shout or cause chaos. The truth, along with the careful steps I had taken, had its own power. My parents' authority, which had once seemed absolute, was diminished. They felt pressure, not just from me, but from the social consequences of their actions. The control they had taken for granted was no longer theirs, and the discomfort they experienced was a result of the life they had chosen for themselves, not mine. I felt a deep sense of relief and satisfaction. The betrayal that had once left me feeling powerless was now fully addressed. I had confronted it, and without resorting to anger or violence, I had made sure my voice was heard. Their embarrassment, the cracks in Claire's perfect world, and the scrutiny from others, all of it reinforced that justice, even quiet and strategic, could be effective. More importantly, I began to rebuild my life. I found a new apartment, one I could call truly mine, and started saving again. I focused on my career, my friendships, and my personal growth. The fear and helplessness that had weighed on me for years slowly lifted. For the first time in a long while, I felt in control of my own destiny. The experience had taught me something vital: betrayal is painful, but it doesn't have to define you. Revenge doesn't have to be loud or destructive, it can be subtle, clever, and ultimately satisfying when it restores balance and allows you to reclaim your life. I had faced the people who had hurt me most and shown them, quietly but clearly, that their actions had consequences. By the time the wedding ended and the chaos settled, I was no longer the powerless daughter who had lost her apartment. I was Emma, strong, independent, and capable of standing up for herself. The betrayal had been real, the hurt had been deep, but the lessons and the victories were mine. I finally felt free. After everything that had happened, I finally found a fresh start. I rented a new apartment, one that I could call completely mine. This time every piece of furniture, every decoration, every corner of the space reflected me, my choices, my style, my hard work. I had saved up again, slowly but steadily, and the pride I felt walking through the door on moving day was indescribable. This wasn't just a place to live, it was proof that I could rebuild, that I could rise above what had been taken from me. Living in my new home, I had space to think and reflect. I thought about how much I had grown through this experience. I realized I was stronger than I had ever imagined. The betrayal I had suffered could have broken me, but instead it had taught me resilience. I was wiser, more cautious, and more aware of who I could trust. Most importantly, I had learned that I could no longer let anyone, family included, control my life or define my worth. I thought back on my parents and Claire. I forgave nothing, but I understood the reality: people make choices, and sometimes those closest to you will disappoint you. That knowledge hurt, but it also freed me. I didn't have to live under their rules or wait for their approval. I could make my own path. The apartment sale, the favoritism, the betrayal, they were no longer chains holding me back. They were lessons that shaped me into someone who would never be powerless again. Rebuilding my life taught me another important truth: reclaiming yourself is the ultimate revenge. I didn't need to punish anyone, expose them, or create drama. By taking control, asserting my independence, and creating a life on my own terms, I had already won. The satisfaction wasn't in hurting them back, it was in standing tall, in proving to myself that no one could erase my worth or my efforts. I filled my days with things that mattered to me: work that I enjoyed, friendships that were supportive, hobbies that brought joy, and quiet evenings in my own space where I could breathe and think without interference. Each day felt like a small victory, a reminder that I was finally living for myself. The shadow of betrayal faded a little more each day, replaced by confidence and hope. Looking ahead, I felt excited about the future. I imagined a life built entirely on my decisions, my rules, and my dreams. I knew challenges would come, but I also knew I had the strength to handle them. The past was behind me, and I was free. For the first time in years, I felt peace. I had taken back what was mine, not just a home, but control over my life. Betrayal had tested me, but it had also made me unshakable. And now, as I looked around my new apartment, I smiled, knowing that the rest of my life would be lived on my terms, and no one could ever take that away from me.